Until you apologize to my son, you're off the project, the CEO said. She calmly submitted her resignation and handed over access. The next morning, the lead investor noticed clause, Section 7.3, in the $18 million contract. The project belongs to her. Silence Zagalovok. The room fell silent the moment she clicked send. Her resignation letter traveled through the corporate servers, like a quiet ripple no one expected to matter. After all, she had just handed over her access, her badge, her entire project. But buried deep inside the $18 million contract, in a clause almost nobody remembered, Section 7.3, was a line that would turn the entire company's morning meeting into a very uncomfortable silence. The conference room on the 23rd floor always smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a promise. Glass towers, slow morning traffic, the quiet hum of a company convinced it was building the future. Emma sat at the far end of the table, her laptop open, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. The $18 million project glowed on the screen in front of her. Months of strategy, late nights, and carefully negotiated agreements. Across the table, the CEO leaned back in his chair with the casual authority of someone who believed the room existed solely for his voice. And beside him sat his son. The young man tapped impatiently on his phone, occasionally glancing at Emma, with the polite disinterest reserved for people whose work you inherit without earning. Emma had seen this before. Companies called it mentorship. Everyone else called it something quieter, nepotism. But she kept her expression calm. The meeting had started like any other status update: slides, numbers, projections. Investors were interested, the timeline was solid, and the legal team had already approved the final contract structure. Everything was moving exactly as planned. Until the CEO interrupted her mid-sentence. "Actually," he said, clasping his hands together as if delivering good news, "starting today, Daniel will be taking a more active leadership role on this project." A few people shifted in their chairs. Emma slowly closed her presentation slide. "Leadership role in what sense?" she asked evenly. Daniel looked up, smiling with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never had to prove competence before. "My father thinks it's time I learn the operational side," he said, "so I'll be overseeing execution." Overseeing. The word hung in the air like a misplaced comma. Emma had written the proposal, negotiated the contract, structured the financing model, built the entire strategic roadmap, and now someone who had attended exactly 2 meetings was going to oversee it. She breathed in slowly. "Daniel hasn't been involved in the negotiations," she said carefully. "The investors expect continuity." The CEO's smile thinned. "They expect results," he replied. Another pause. Then Daniel leaned forward, suddenly irritated. "Look," he said, waving a dismissive hand, "you made this way more complicated than it needs to be. I went through the deck last night and honestly, half of this could be simplified." Emma blinked. Not from anger, from curiosity. Because Daniel had just casually dismissed 6 months of regulatory compliance, financial structuring, and investor risk protection. And he didn't even realize it. The CFO quietly stared at his notebook. No one else spoke. Emma turned to Daniel. "What exactly would you simplify?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "Well, first of all, the ownership structure. Why is the intellectual framework tied to your consulting entity during Phase 1? The question sounded confident, but it revealed something else entirely. He had read only the first page of the contract. Emma felt a flicker of something behind her calm expression. Not anger, not yet. Just a small, quiet realization. He had no idea what he was talking about. She began to explain. But the CEO raised his hand. "That's enough," he said. The room froze again. Emma looked at him. "Daniel is right," the CEO continued. "The project needs to move faster, and frankly, the tension in this room tells me something else." His eyes settled on Emma. "You've been difficult about this transition." A soft murmur traveled around the table. Difficult. The word executives used when competence became inconvenient. Emma straightened slightly in her chair. "I'm protecting the structure the investors approved," she said calmly. The CEO leaned forward. "And you'll continue protecting it," he replied. Another pause. Then he added the sentence that would echo through the company by morning. "Until you apologize to my son," he said slowly, "you're off the project." Silence. The kind of silence that makes people stare very carefully at their laptops. Emma felt every eye in the room shift away. Apologize. For explaining the contract, for questioning a decision, for not pretending this was normal. She looked at Daniel. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he leaned back, satisfied. Emma closed her laptop. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet click. "Understood," she said. Then she stood. No argument, no raised voice. Just a small, almost polite nod. "If that's the decision," she added, "I'll formalize my resignation." The CEO blinked. He hadn't expected that. Most people argued, negotiated, stayed. Emma simply gathered her things. As she reached the door, the legal director quietly looked up. There was something unusual in his expression. Not concern. Recognition. Emma stepped into the hallway, the glass door closing softly behind her. Inside the room, Daniel was already talking about simplifying the timeline. Inside her inbox, the $18 million contract sat quietly in the archive. And deep inside that document, hidden among 20 pages of legal language, was Clause Section 7.3. Most people in the room had never read it, but Emma had written it herself. And if anyone bothered to look closely tomorrow morning, the entire company would suddenly realize something. They hadn't removed her from the project. They had just removed themselves from it. The next morning, one person would finally read that clause. The office looked different when Emma returned to it that evening. Not emotionally different, structurally different. When you resign from a company, the space begins to behave like a hotel room after checkout. The same furniture, the same soft hum of air conditioning, the same glass reflections in the hallway. But suddenly, nothing belongs to you anymore. Emma sat at her desk while the building slowly emptied. Most employees had already left. A few lights still glowed behind frosted meeting room glass, where late conversations about strategy or damage control were probably happening. But on her floor, the silence had begun to stretch long and quiet. Her resignation email had already circulated through senior leadership. 3 short paragraphs. Calm. Professional. No emotion. The CEO had not replied. Daniel had not replied either. But HR had responded within 8 minutes. A short message. "We acknowledge receipt of your resignation. Please ensure all project access and materials are transferred to the internal team before departure." Emma almost smiled. They believed the transition would be simple, clean, administrative. They believed this was about access. So she began doing exactly what they asked. One by one, she opened the internal systems, the project dashboard, the investor communication channel, the financial modeling workspace. Each login window blinked quietly in the dim office light. She removed her credentials, transferred administrative access, archived documents, everything done methodically, calmly, exactly as requested. But there was something the company never quite understood about complex contracts. The most important power inside them is rarely visible. And the people who don't read them carefully tend to assume the obvious structure is the real one. Emma opened one last folder. Investment Agreement, final signed. 27 pages. Dense legal language. 6 months of negotiations between the company and the lead investor group. Every clause carefully balanced. Every protection designed to make the project stable. Emma scrolled slowly through the document, past sections on timelines, past regulatory compliance requirements, past payment milestones, until she reached the paragraph she remembered writing at 2:40 in the morning months earlier. Clause section 7.3. She paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, out of respect, because that clause had been written for a very specific reason. During early negotiations, the investors had asked a quiet question: who guarantees continuity if internal leadership changes? At the time, it sounded hypothetical. Corporate instability, executive reshuffles, typical investor concerns. Emma had answered calmly. She would structure a safeguard, a clause ensuring that the project's intellectual architecture remained tied to the person who designed it during the initial phase, not to the company, not to the executive team, but to the contracting architect of the framework. The CEO had skimmed past that section months ago. Daniel had probably never seen it. And tonight, Emma simply confirmed something. Clause section 7.3 was still there, still intact, still signed by every party involved. She closed the document. Then she sent one final email. Not to HR, not to the CEO, but to the Investor Liaison Office. Subject line: Resignation Notice, Project Transition Documentation. The message itself was polite, professional. Attached were the exact materials they would need to understand the transition structure defined in the contract. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just clarity. Emma pressed send. The email disappeared into the quiet digital bloodstream of corporate communication. Then she shut down her laptop. Outside, the city lights had started to glow in the glass towers across the street. The same city that tomorrow morning would wake up to a perfectly ordinary executive briefing. The CEO would arrive confident. Daniel would begin simplifying the project. The board would expect progress updates. Everything would appear normal, until someone in the investor meeting asked a routine question, and someone from legal finally opened the contract again. Because investors tend to read the parts executives ignore. And when they reached clause section 7.3, they would discover something the CEO never expected. The project wasn't merely managed by Emma. Legally speaking, the project belonged to her during phase 1. The room would go quiet. The CEO would stop speaking mid-sentence. Daniel would suddenly realize the structure he had called too complicated was actually protecting something very specific. And the lead investor would slowly close the contract and say a sentence that no one in that boardroom was prepared to hear. But by then, it would already be too late, because the email Emma sent tonight would be the first document they read tomorrow morning. If you've ever seen someone punished for doing their job right, you know how this feels. What would you have done in Emma's place? Tell me in the comments. Morning meetings in large companies often begin with the illusion of control. Coffee cups appear. Laptops open. Someone adjusts the blinds so the sunlight doesn't reflect on the presentation screen. The CEO clears his throat, and for a few seconds, everyone pretends the day will unfold exactly as planned. This morning began the same way. The executive conference room on the 23rd floor slowly filled with quiet confidence. The CEO arrived first, jacket draped over one arm, speaking casually with the CFO about timelines and deliverables. Daniel entered a few minutes later, carrying a tablet and the relaxed posture of someone expecting his first real leadership moment. He even looked excited. The $18 million project was supposed to be his first major success. The board members joined next, followed by the internal legal team. Finally, the screen at the end of the table flickered to life as the lead investor connected remotely from New York. "Good morning, everyone," the investor said, adjusting his glasses. The CEO smiled. "Morning. We're excited to show you the updated execution plan." Daniel leaned forward slightly. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The CEO began speaking confidently, summarizing the transition. "As of yesterday evening, we've made some leadership adjustments to streamline the project," he said. "Emma is no longer involved in daily operations. Daniel will be overseeing execution moving forward." The words landed smoothly on the table. almost too smoothly, because on the other end of the call, the lead investor stopped writing. He looked up slowly. "Emma resigned?" he asked. The CEO nodded. "Yes. We're handling the transition internally." Another pause. The investor leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said carefully, "before we continue, could someone from legal confirm the continuity structure in the agreement?" The room shifted slightly. The CEO waved a hand. "Standard protections, nothing unusual." The investor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to someone sitting beside him off camera. "Could you pull the contract?" he asked quietly. A few seconds passed. Back in the conference room, Daniel opened the new project roadmap on the screen. He began explaining how the structure would be simplified. "We're removing a few unnecessary layers," he said confidently. "Once we restructure the oversight model, execution should move faster." The CFO nodded politely, but the legal director at the far end of the table had stopped typing. Because on the screen in front of him, the investor's legal team had just opened the document. 27 pages, scrolling, silence. Then the investor spoke again. "Page 19, he said calmly. The legal director looked up. "What about it?" "Clause 7.3. The words hung in the room like a quiet alarm bell. The legal director opened the contract, scrolled, found the clause, and suddenly stopped moving. For a moment, he simply stared at the screen. The CEO noticed. "What is it?" he asked. The legal director didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and read the paragraph again. Slowly, very slowly, Daniel shifted in his chair. "What does it say?" he asked. Another pause. The legal director finally looked up. Not at Daniel, at the CEO. "Clause section 7.3 defines project continuity during phase 1, he said. The CEO frowned slightly. "Yes, we know. That's standard." The legal director shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "This one isn't." Across the screen, the investor folded his hands. "Please read it aloud," he said. The legal director hesitated. Then he began. During Phase 1 implementation, the intellectual architecture and operational framework of the project remain under the legal authorship and supervisory authority of the originating architect defined herein as Emma Carter. Daniel blinked. The CEO leaned forward. "Keep reading," the investor said. The legal director swallowed. "In the event of termination, resignation, or removal of said architect by the company, operational rights revert exclusively to the originating architect until renegotiation is formally executed by the investor group." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. The CEO stared at him. "What does that mean?" Daniel asked. The legal director closed the contract slowly. "It means," he said carefully, "that during Phase 1, the project cannot legally operate without Emma." No one spoke. Not the CFO, not Daniel, not the CEO. On the video screen, the investor finally broke the silence. "Let me simplify it," he said. He adjusted the document in front of him and read the line one more time. Then he looked directly into the camera. "Until renegotiation," he said calmly, "the project belongs to her." The conference room went completely still, because suddenly everyone realized something. Emma hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She hadn't fought. She had simply walked out of the building and taken the entire project structure with her. For a moment, the conference room seemed to forget how sound worked. The air conditioning hummed softly. Someone's coffee machine in the hallway hissed. A phone vibrated quietly on the table and then stopped. But inside the room, no one spoke. The CEO stared at the legal director as if the man had just misread the document. "That can't be correct," he said finally. The legal director didn't respond immediately. He simply rotated his laptop so the clause faced the center of the table. The paragraph sat there calmly, black letters on white background, indifferent to authority or ego. Clause Section 7.3. Daniel leaned forward. But she resigned, he said. Doesn't that cancel the clause? The legal director shook his head. No, he said quietly. Another pause. Clause Section 7.3 activates precisely in that scenario. The words landed slowly. Across the screen, the lead investor rested his chin against his hand, studying the room with patient curiosity. He had seen this before. Companies loved ambition, but investors loved contracts. The CEO finally leaned back in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She can't hold the entire project hostage." No one corrected him, because technically she wasn't holding anything hostage. The clause simply described ownership of the project architecture during the first phase. Emma hadn't threatened anyone. She had only followed the structure everyone had signed. Daniel's confidence was beginning to crack. "So we just— what?" he asked. "Pause the project?" The CFO spoke for the first time since the clause was read. "If we proceed without renegotiation," he said slowly, "we violate the investor agreement." The CEO's jaw tightened. "And if we renegotiate?" The legal director answered. "Then the investor group must approve a new structure." The room shifted, because everyone understood what that meant. The investors now had the leverage, and investors tended to ask uncomfortable questions when leverage appeared. On the screen, the lead investor leaned forward slightly. "Before we discuss renegotiation," he said calmly, "I'd like to understand something." The CEO forced a polite smile. "Of course." The investor's voice remained neutral. "Why did Emma resign?" Another silence. The CEO opened his mouth, then closed it again, because suddenly the explanation sounded very different when investors were listening. Daniel spoke instead. "There was a disagreement," he said. "A management transition." The investor watched him quietly. "And the disagreement was serious enough for the project architect to leave?" Daniel hesitated. "Well, yes." The investor nodded slowly. "Interesting." Behind him, someone on his legal team whispered something. The investor listened. Then he looked back at the room. "You understand," he said, "that our entire financial commitment is based on the architecture Emma designed." The CEO shifted slightly. "Of course." And Clause Section 7.3 was included specifically to protect that architecture. Another pause. The CEO's voice tightened. "Yes." The investor folded the contract closed. "So now we have a situation," he said calmly, "where the architect has resigned, and according to the agreement," he tapped the document lightly, "the project legally follows her." No one moved. The CEO's earlier authority had evaporated into something brittle. Daniel stared at the table. The CFO looked like he was calculating worst-case scenarios. And the legal director simply waited. Because in corporate negotiations, the next sentence often decides the next 6 months. The investor spoke again. "We will need to speak with Emma directly." The CEO stiffened. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly. The investor raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Yes," the CEO continued. "We'll resolve this internally." But the investor's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid that may not be possible." Another quiet shock rippled through the room, because investors rarely repeated themselves unless the decision was already made. The CEO's voice lowered. "Why not?" The investor opened his tablet and turned it toward the camera. An email sat at the top of the screen. Subject line: Resignation Notice. Project Transition Documentation sent 12 hours earlier. From Emma. The investor looked back at the executives. "She already contacted us." Silence returned to the room, heavier than before. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. Because for the first time since yesterday's meeting, he realized something unsettling. Emma hadn't reacted emotionally. She hadn't tried to argue. She hadn't even tried to stay. Instead, she had calmly sent one email. And that email had reached the only people in the room whose opinion truly mattered: the investors. But what Emma wrote in that message was about to make the situation even more uncomfortable. The investor didn't open the email immediately. Instead, he looked at the room one more time, the way experienced negotiators do when they want everyone to fully understand the moment they're standing in. Because some moments in business feel small while they happen, and enormous once the consequences arrive. The CEO tried to regain control. "Well," he said carefully, "I'm sure the message simply clarifies the transition." The investor gave a polite, almost neutral smile. "Yes," he said. Then he opened it. The email appeared on the screen behind him. Emma's writing was exactly what everyone in the room expected from her. Clear, professional, precise. No accusations. No emotional language. Just information. The investor began reading aloud. "Dear Investor Group, following my resignation yesterday evening, I want to ensure full transparency regarding the operational structure defined in Clause Section 7.3 of the Phase 1 agreement." The legal director lowered his eyes slightly. He already knew where this was going. The investor continued. "As the originating architect of the project framework, the contract specifies that operational rights revert to the architect in the event of resignation or removal by the company until renegotiation occurs." Daniel shifted in his chair. The sentence sounded much heavier when spoken out loud. The investor read the next line. "This clause was introduced during negotiations to guarantee continuity of the project architecture for the investor group." Another pause. The CEO stared at the screen. He remembered the meeting where the clause had been discussed. He had nodded, signed, moved on. Because at the time, it had sounded like a technicality. The investor continued reading. "To avoid disruption to your investment timeline, I remain available to ensure continuity of the project structure under the conditions already defined in the agreement." Daniel frowned slightly. "Wait," he whispered. The investor finished the final paragraph. "Please feel free to contact me directly if clarification is required." The email ended there. No drama, no threats, just a quiet statement of fact. The investor closed the message. Then he looked back at the executives in the conference room. "You see the situation," he said calmly. The CEO's voice was tight. "Yes. We invested $18 million based on a specific architecture," the investor continued. "And that architecture legally remains under Emma's supervision until renegotiation." No one argued, because there was nothing to argue with. The contract said exactly that. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "So, what happens now?" he asked. The investor folded his hands together. "Well," he said, "there are two possibilities." The room leaned into the silence. "Option 1, the investor said, you renegotiate the agreement and rebuild the project structure." The CFO immediately understood what that meant. Months of delay, legal costs, and possibly losing the investment entirely. The investor continued. "Option 2. He tapped the tablet lightly. "You ask Emma to continue the project exactly as designed." The CEO stared at the table, because the second option carried a different kind of cost. Pride, authority, control. The same control he had tried to assert yesterday in the meeting. Daniel finally spoke. "Could we bring her back?" he asked quietly. The legal director gave a small, almost ironic smile. "She didn't leave the project," he said. Everyone looked at him. He tapped the contract again. "She left the company." The distinction landed slowly across the table, because suddenly the structure of the entire situation became clear. Emma hadn't fought the CEO. She hadn't challenged Daniel. She hadn't even defended herself in the meeting. She had simply stepped aside and allowed the contract to speak. The investor stood from his chair on the screen. "Please let us know how you'd like to proceed," he said. Then he added one final sentence. Calm, almost conversational. "But until renegotiation occurs." He glanced once more at Clause Section 7.3. The project belongs to her. The call disconnected. The conference room fell quiet again. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Cars crossed intersections. Elevators rose and fell. Emails traveled silently through servers. And somewhere across the city, Emma sat in a quiet cafe, with her laptop open, reviewing project timelines exactly as she had the day before. The only difference was simple. Yesterday, she had worked inside the company. Today, the company needed permission to work with her.